Greetings, friends. This is Ian McKenzie here, and I am joined by two men to dive into a conversation around a number of themes: men's work, Eros, archetypes, mythology. And we've recently all been sharing space at an event that Deus and I co-created and offered for the first time up here on Vancouver Island as part of our series of Masculinity, Sex, and Myth. And this particular event was called Eating the Shadow. And we were joined by transformational coach and author Matt Sturm, who I've been tracking a little ways through the last few months or so with mutual friends, and also the work he's been putting out online, including two books. One is almost available to the public, but the first is a lore book on the magician, and the second is the warrior, of which is two parts of a series that I'm sure he'll talk about in a second. But it was a great delight to have Matt join Deus and I in the container, a 5-day event that we put together. And so we thought that it would be interesting to have a conversation around just some of the themes that came up, the experiences. Also a sense that this conversation is perhaps very interesting to other men who facilitate, hold this kind of work, but also, to the general person who's interested in these kind of themes. It'll probably be interesting as well. So welcome, Matt Sturm.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And to Deus, my collaborator as well, Deus, in this triad.
Maybe I can just jump in to kick it off to frame what Eating the Shadow is and how it kind of formed, and then how you and I connected, Matt. So Ian and I have been putting on retreats for just over a year now. We've done 4 level 1s, which is called Awakening the Wild Erotic. And this was our first level 2 immersion 5-day retreat. And then we also have an online program called The Deep Masculine, which is a 3-month online container. And this has been many years in the making. Ian and I have been friends for 8 or 9 years now and really have walked parallel on this path of opening up to a fuller spectrum of mature eroticism and working with men in mythopoetic and also psychotherapeutic ways. And finally, all those forces converged and we started collaborating. And Matt jumped in for our level 2 with a huge range of experiences and strong background in men's work. And so it was really beautiful to have you there at the offering. Mm-hmm. And it was really unique for me because we had never met and didn't really have a relationship going into it. And so I was excited and also very curious about what it was that inspired you to join that container with the wealth of experience that you already had. And it was a beautiful, beautiful journey. And so it's very curious and inspiring for me when men who are working in this field of men's work come together to cross-pollinate and to share experiences. And so, I just love to hear from my own personal curiosity, what is your background and how did it draw you towards this experience? And maybe we can just kind of launch into there, like what is men's work and how does this all tie together?
Great. Okay. So how I ended up on this call today is I've been engaged as a sex educator, a therapist, a coach. I've led men's work and men's retreats for several years now. And in the spring, I published my first book, which Ian referenced. It's called The Organic Masculine. And in the process of starting to bring that book out into the world, I was like, who do I need to be in conversation with? Who is doing similar work to what I'm passionate about here? And at the top of my list rose Ian of the Mythic Masculine podcast, because my book focuses quite strongly on archetypes and myth as a central component of men's work. And so we had some mutual friends, and Ian and I started a conversation a little over a year ago just to get to know each other. And then he started sharing with me about his work focused on Eros and eroticism with men. And I have a background, led a couple of different communities over the years. I've led many, many workshops around sacred sexuality, sexual neo-tantra. And so I was like, oh, there's even more overlap here than I thought. And Ian and I, through our conversations, we're both busy people. We're like, well, what is the collaboration here? How do we want to engage with each other? And there were various ideas that we threw around. And finally, Ian was like, hey, why don't you just come to my retreat, to the retreat that you two throw? And I was like, okay, great, I'm in. So it was interesting for me to come into a retreat. I'd never met either of you in person before. Similarly, it was a 6-day retreat, so it's a big container to step into. And I was coming in not from the growth edges that were held by most of the participants, just having been exposed to a bunch of this work already, but I was coming in as someone who got to kind of sit in the seat of a participant, which for me is such a delight because usually I'm the one holding the space and I'm responsible for these things and tracking everything. And I just got to show up and work my edges, which is great, but also to get to see how two other very competent, beautiful human beings hold space in a context that I have developed my own voice and path in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, kind of like tying this in, like, what do you perceive the territory of men's work to be, and why is it like, why are you compelled to connect with other people who are putting on offerings in this field? And I have my own perspective on this as well, but I'd love to hear from you as well. Like, what is the territory of men's work?
The territory of men's work begins with the recognition that we who have been socialized as men have some work to do around how we hold masculinity, and that there's a way that we can show up to shape our own understanding and expression of masculinity, that we can do healing around our gender, and that there's a more authentic us that lies beneath the script that has been handed to us by our culture for what it means to be a man. And that's kind of the entry point. And that was my entry point. My entry point was similar, I think, to a lot of men, which was a decade ago, my girlfriend was like, "You need men's work." And I was like, "Oh, okay." I don't know what that is, but I'm willing to check it out. And then I got into it and I was like, "Oh, this is great." And so it's the experience that I have inside a men's container, whether that's an ongoing men's group or in a men's retreat, that has got me lit up about it to the point where I want to devote a significant part of my career and time and energy to it. And it turns out, for me at least, that masculinity is this amazing doorway into transformation.
Yeah, it's great how much support we have from the feminine, hey?
Yeah, totally. I was like, "No,
go do this."
No, you need this.
Yeah, I can relate. It's funny. I got a lot of men. Well, I don't know about a lot. I have a lot of women who are really advocating for their partners to come into this kind of work, and generally they're very resistant when it's coming from their partner. And so, on that note, just wanted to celebrate you for having the humility to receive that and to pursue it.
Well, thank you.
My curiosity is to give a sense of the lay of the land. Like, what do you see out there in the ecosystem of men's work? Right? Because not all of it is, quote, the same. They may have somewhat of similar intention to a degree, but I'd be curious to know how you see, and maybe both of you, like the state of men's work right now.
So the context is that we are a few years out from the Me Too movement, which I think was a wake-up call that the way we're doing masculinity culturally is not okay, that the status quo needs to shift, and that there's a reclamation of voices around the harm that has been caused by men. And so what I see today is kind of in the wake of the Me Too movement, some men saying, "Oh, what I've got here, I need to work on because there's what I'm doing is causing harm. I can see that has caused harm in the past." And then on the other side, there's the fear of how do I show up as a man? How do I show up as a sexual man? How do I navigate that terrain without getting canceled, without hurting someone through my privilege or through my blind spots? So that's the context broadly socially for me that I see. But then there's a wide range of offerings from self-organized men's groups. Somebody says, hey, I've got some buddies in my neighborhood. Let's meet once a month and let's talk about life. To larger organizations like the Sacred Sons or Mankind Project, where there are structure, there are ongoing retreats, and they're big. There's many men involved. They gather sometimes hundreds of men at a retreat to participate in the gathering. And then there's, psychedelic focused men's work. There's faith-based men's work. There's, I think, Ian, your term or a term out there is the manosphere. There's the broader range of all sorts of offerings around masculinity and what it means to be a man. Promise Keepers is in the evangelical Christian movement. So there's a huge range out there.
Yeah, this is interesting. I've observed there's many different camps, so to speak, in this broad category of men's work, and a lot of them have very different perspectives of what is important to address in this territory. And for me personally, it was never like a very clear-cut decision of, okay, I'm going to get into men's work now. I mostly got into it because I recognized that there were certain elements that I was really struggling with and that I needed support with throughout my life that I wanted to transfer over to other men. And what I was observing in the work that I was doing, because I was a facilitator and a practitioner before I started focusing more on men's work, was that a lot of men these days, from what I'm observing, they're very confused about who they are, what it means to be a man, what masculine is, and how they're supposed to be. Like, a lot of men have this idea that there's something that they are supposed to be, and they don't know what it is, and they don't know how to access it and to express it. And so they're like floundering around and they're trying to find this information. Like, how am I supposed to show up in the world in a good way? And they're kind of caught between this rock and hard place of trying to remedy wounds from the past and cultural conditioning and programming and all this stuff. But they're also kind of trapped in this place of not being able to step into a fuller expression of their own authenticity and their own sense of personal power, because they're diametrically opposed from the messages that they're receiving externally. And so they're not sharing what's actually going on inside from an authentic place, because they're trying to appease and tend others. And within that, there's kind of like a shrinking and lack of a sense of worth and personal power, and all of the ways that men have historically arrived at this sense of purpose in their lives are not accessible, to the modern man. And so there's a very confused space that a lot of guys are in. And a lot of the territory that I've observed in other containers didn't really resonate with me. A lot of this stereotypical hyper masculine approach, like just tying into archetypes, like the king archetype and the warrior archetype are very sexy archetypes, and men want to step into this. And there's a lot of like, rah, and like aggression and, and willpower and being unshakable, a lot of these things. And there's certainly value there, but there's a whole other dimension here to the element of men's work that is not often spoken to. It's starting to kind of rise up in our culture, of accessing some of the feminine depths of emotion, of intuition, of accessing the invisible realms in tangible ways, and also kind of untangling their identity from patterns of behavior or certain cultural conditioning that we've received. And that creates a lot of space to reimagine what masculinity is. And I think that discovery process is a big part of the stage of men's work that we're in right now, of actually redefining masculinity into something that's actually life affirming, and doing that without actually degrading men or masculinity, and not reasserting a dominant kind of consumptive approach towards life. And so there's a lot of creative potential here rather than seeking a single definition. It's more about redefining the creative possibilities of what it means to be a man, which is, very exciting, but can also be very challenging to not have like a very defined template of what we're shooting for.
I couldn't agree more, Deus. I recently listened to Ian's podcast, or Ian's webinar on the mythopoetics, and you gave the picture of the regenerative masculine, with these qualities that align with how life operates. And my book, The Organic Masculine, it's exactly the same core, which is let's find life affirming masculinity. We need to redefine it in terms of wholeness and authenticity. And it is not going to be a picture that any of us facilitators can give to men and say, hey, be this character, do this thing. It actually has to be unique to each of us as we find our own centers and then begin to operate from there.
Well, this could be an interesting segue into also the realm of Eros and that role of that within the containers that Deus and I created, particularly for eating the shadow, and our first level is awakening the wild erotic, but also many themes that you yourself, Matt, have also been exploring. But for me, how those link together is that, just like was just named, it's not about finding some kind of universalist imposition of masculinity, but what I see is what happens when we gather and put life at the center. How does each man orient themselves, right, to the intelligence of that force and open themselves up, right, to a wider field of aliveness, and allowing that itself to orient, right, that their own personal journey, as we're all circling around that central hearth, is kind of how it's emerging for me as I see, what's being said and the experiences that we've had there. So I think maybe the question too is why is the Eros as well in a container like this for men so important?
It's a big question. For me, maybe I'll just frame this a little bit. So I went through some traumatic experiences as a young child in regards to sexuality and eroticism that really crossed a lot of wires for me. And so it created this hyper fixation and fascination, almost obsession with sexual curiosity, but also an intense fight or flight response in my nervous system, a lot of panic, a lot of fear. And I can see, looking back on my life, how a lot of my development and personality and personal and professional pursuits kind of gravitated around this core theme of a desire to connect intimately with others. And the pain of not being able to access that, both sexually, but also just on non-sexual intimate levels with myself, with other men, and with women. And so this was a huge driving force for me. I really struggled with loneliness, and still do to a certain degree, and find that a lot of men struggle with that. A lot of men are isolated and lonely and disconnected and often depressed or angry that there's no outlet. There's no space where they can actually just be themselves and be accepted and to be received in a way that's actually connecting. And so this is something that I struggled with. And as I dove deeper into that, what Ian and I call Eros, this intelligent life force at the heart of life itself, seems to be the core of this exploration. And how that ties in on a practical level is learning how we relate to our inner worlds and how we relate to our external environment, and learning how to cultivate that in a way that creates deeper connection rather than fracturing or fragmenting relationship. And in the containers that you and I have held, Ian, I found that this is a big part of the work, actually, is kind of de-armoring so that we can fully expose ourselves in a space where that we can be accepted and loved and received. And then from there, starting to amplify our authentic expression and the revelation of truth that comes from that, and the sense of deep connection and brotherhood that's formed through those shares, that vulnerability expressed in supportive and received in supportive ways actually creates the connection that everybody's longing for. And so it becomes more than anything else for me, it's about exploring the territory that is currently inaccessible for each individual in a space where all is accepted, so that we can actually discover who each person really is in their heart and learn how to celebrate them so that they can actually live their gifts. And this isn't gender exclusive. Like that concept is not gender exclusive, but there's something that is really unique about getting a group of men together to do this, because there's a lot of cultural conditioning that comes in with that has prevented men from actually fully exposing the most vulnerable places, which generally leads them to feel emasculated because they're expressing something that's soft or vulnerable or weak, and so to turn the tables on that script is a huge starting point and kind of like a central focus. And the exploration of Eros kind of ties it all together. Eros as this force that is seeking to draw us into intimate connection with the rest of life. And then obviously that includes exploring sexuality and how we've been programmed around that and the trauma that we have around that and the distortions around that. But it is a much broader territory than just sex. It's about learning how to relate intimately to the rest of life in a way that is regenerative and life supportive. So for me, Eros is actually at the heart of what most people are struggling with.
Yeah, beautiful. I completely resonate with this perspective around the erotic nature of life and how that connects with our own sexuality and the draw for intimacy with partners, intimacy with life, intimacy with ourselves. The more I explore my Eros, the more connected to myself, the more I discover about myself, and the more of my conditioning and resistance and avoidance I get in contact with. And that's why I keep coming back to sexuality and Eros as in my own personal exploration and journey. And so what I was blown away with is that in the retreat that you two just held, that I was a participant in, you were able to invite in a deep, real, and powerful exploration of our erotic natures in a way that was safe. And it was evidenced by the fact that the men, us participants in the retreat, were each able to open up in our own ways into that exploration, that we felt safe, that we felt like we were held in the container, that we felt like we had the tools in order to navigate the complexity of, okay, well, what happens if I get turned on here?
Matt, can you say something too about the word safe? Because again, people may hear that different ways, but in this kind of container, what is safety?
Mm-hmm. Oh, what is safety in this container? I mean, I can share my perspective on that. And then I want to hear your both perspective on it also, because I really have gone deep into this topic. Okay. For me, safety operates on a number of levels. There's body level safety, which includes our nervous system and basic physiology. And like, is this organism under physical threat or strain? And so we need to be able to reasonably assure ourselves that, okay, my body's going to be safe here. And then I can relax into this space, right? And then there's egoic safety. My personality self wants to maintain this identity picture that I have for me. And that's not a real thing in the sense it's real insofar as I experience it, but it's not foundational to who I am. It's not the same as my soul essence or the source consciousness that moves through all of us. And so the safety that my personality Matt wants to maintain is like, okay, don't disrupt me. Don't do anything that might get me out of my comfort zone. And these types of containers are meant to like gently, shake that up. They're providing opportunities for us to get outside of our normal comfort or what I might conceive as safety. But with that, some containers are like, you're getting out of your zone right now, and we're going to forcibly move you into something that's new or foreign. Your container said from the beginning, everything that you do here is optional. You get to participate at the level that you choose, right? So you gave the choice, the sovereignty to each man to say, okay, I want to step into this uncomfortable thing that might feel unsafe, that might feel like it threatens who I think I am. And that is the magic.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I do want to hear what you have to say on this, Ian, before.
On safety. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that too, because I do think that like oftentimes safety in depending on the container can get thrown around, and it can, I would say, it can be unearned, right? That safety is like declared at the beginning of something. Like I'm thinking of I won't go into detail, but another gathering, right, that I was at where the organizers kind of declared up front, this is a safe space, and they did this stuff. And then what happened for the next 3 days for a lot of the participants was not safe. And so, of course, the incongruence there created a lot of like mistrust and resentment, and it just didn't go well. And so I do think that there's something around, like you just said, Matt, like we can create a sense of like conditions of sovereignty to participate in ways that actually deliberately create the perception, perhaps, or the experience of unsafety, but with purpose. And it strikes me too, right? Like any initiatory process is generally engineered specifically to, make you unsafe in the ways that the safety has perhaps been too constricting, right, for that time. I'm thinking like a wilderness vigil, right, where you're brought out to nature and left, put in nature, ritually speaking, and it's very unsafe to the egoic comfort of identity of who I want to think I should be and all this kind of stuff, but it's with a purpose. And so I hear that's what you're saying. It's like there's ways of setting it up. So there's an ability to dynamically choose unsafety within the safetiness of the entire container. So I personally, I just love that dynamic paradox in a way, and how important that is for transformational spaces.
Yeah, there's something here for me about creating a culture of safety, because all the pieces that you guys are talking about, it can't just be coming from the facilitators or the space holders, because we're co-creating that space, and conflicting judgments or criticisms or hierarchy can create a lack of safety for anybody who's there. So I see this as a shift in culture, actually. And for me, there's some critical pieces that have really informed how I approach my work as a space holder, which I feel like it is my job to actually transfer these tools and these skills over to others so that they can access more territory in themselves and in each other. And the prime directive for me in all the work that I'm doing is to honor free will, to never infringe on another person's free will, to honor their choice, their agency, and to really celebrate that, to honor their yeses and to honor their nos, and to really celebrate their willingness to express that. So that's first and foremost. And then there's 3 key pieces that I'm applying actively. The first is no personal agenda. So I'm not trying to impose my own perspective onto another person. I'm not trying to accomplish anything specific for them. I'm trying to help understand. I'm trying to understand them as fully as possible and to support them in the things that they're pursuing. The second is infinite patience, meaning no timeline. I'm not trying to rush a person. I'm not trying to slow them down unless I'm looking to offer some reflections on a pattern, not to change the pattern, but to illuminate something that is repeating so that they have greater insight around how and why they're operating. And then the third one is probably the most important, which is unconditional positive regard.
Yep.
And this is the main thing that I'm seeking to transmit through direct experience, is that there's actually no enemies here, both with the other men, but also with the feelings that show up. Because this sense of fear or uneasiness or this lack of safety will inevitably arise as you're looking to address wounds and the defense mechanisms that have been built around them. And those defense mechanisms, those patterns, even those addictions, they all serve an intelligent purpose. They're not an enemy. They're not something to be destroyed. Rather, they're something to come into intimate contact with and to repair a broken relationship with an aspect of self. And they're actually trying to serve your system in some way, shape, or form. As soon as everybody can understand that concept, not in theory, but through direct experience, then any adversarial relationship within the space just kind of disappears, both internally and externally, because we're opening up into profound curiosity and empathy, because we're seeking to understand ourselves and each other without some sort of moralistic judgmental framework or trying to replicate a template and then judging men for whether or not they succeed or fail. So we're dissolving the adversarial relationship within ourselves and with each other to make space for all things. And that is what creates the foundational level of safety to go into quote unquote unsafe feelings. If we can ally around that, then the only direction is expansion. Even if somebody decides that they reach a threshold and they're like, actually, this is my limit, this is a no for me. Great. Thank you so much for being willing and able to voice that. That's really important. You can celebrate everything that shows up rather than trying to pigeonhole it into, a single outcome or even a single direction. I think that is what kind of creates this overarching container of safety for me.
Mm.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And I want to add, I have two thoughts. One is I'm just remembering the third level of safety that I work with. So there's body level, there's intellectual level, and then there's the soul level. And our souls are always inherently and innately safe. And they're here taking us on this journey. This journey is for us. And what we're doing in a men's retreat container is soul work. We're creating the space for men's souls to start guiding them more fully and for men to start finding that light, that gold, and aligning to it. And from that perspective, the hardships that we've been through, whatever has happened to us is actually here for us. And that's another big reorientation on the path. And when I first was like, oh, my soul is always safe, I got angry. Like my personality, Matt, was like, you're putting me through all this shit. I'm not choosing this, but you're doing it so that you can get your learning on. And I was like, oh man, I'm pissed about that. But the safety,
get your learning on.
Yeah. But that layer of safety is also something that I can relax into. Wherever my path is taking me, there's a greater purpose in it. And I'm here for it.
Well, I wanted to introduce another piece then too, particularly the exploration of Eros and in a men's space, which is actually very edgy, of course, in a time when, the dominant culture of the West is any men showing any kind of, sensual affection to each other or something is generally immediately classified as, gay or feminine or like I think a lot of us probably exist within a bubble that, again, that kind of thing is maybe less edgy. But for the general populace, right, this territory is extremely fraught, right, with a lot that can come up. And so what is the importance of safety around this particular energy in a men's space? And also to name up front, right, that, it's Deus and I have co-created this space to be it's a non-sexual space, but it is a sensual space in regards to opening to the sensuality of all of life, but that there's some kind of intimacy among men that is cultivated that I experience too when the space is, a lot of men deeply long for, but actually don't know how to get in the general day-to-day life, of course, or even know that that's something that they long for because of how fraught this territory is for men who are in a culture of, not allowed to experience these feelings with other men or not allowed to even have a degree of intimacy, right? In many ways, even like deep friendship often, right, is very inaccessible to a lot of men in general. So my curiosity is, what's the importance of holding or creating a safe space to experience this kind of energy, to cultivate this kind of energy among men, and what the value is, particularly at a time when masculinity often is this, even as we're seeing now, we're recording this a few days after the election in the US, and a kind of strong man, patriarch masculinity is rising to the fore across the nation, if you're talking about the US. And so again, this kind of sensitive, loving connection of intimacy between men seems even more fugitive, but necessary.
I'll just share a personal story here where I was very fortunate in that my father, growing up, was very physically affectionate. So he would like read us stories and we'd be on his lap and he would give me hugs and, kisses on the cheek or the forehead. And it felt so good to receive that from him. And, when I was young, I think I was in grade 1 or something, grade 2 maybe, he ended up being one of the chaperones for a field trip. I forgot the word to it. We went on a field trip when we were younger, and like I ran up to him and I hugged him and I called him Daddy. I was like 6 or 7 years old or something. And I remember when I went back to my classmates, mostly the boys, they all started making fun of me for hugging my father and for calling him Daddy. And all of a sudden, this was like a total paradigm shift for me, where all of a sudden something that was so beautiful and so nourishing and welcome was all of a sudden taboo and judged and criticized. And I wasn't allowed to do that anymore. And I didn't know why. Nobody explained it to me. It was just the social rules, the unspoken social rules had just been established all of a sudden. And so, and right around that time, over the next few years, things like "you're gay" started becoming an insult, as like the worst thing that you could be as a boy was gay. And so the nature of my relationship to boys started to shift to be more competitive and like rambunctious, and we were challenging each other, but there was also this kind of like undertone of like longing for connection, and even physical closeness, but the ways that we had to go about it had shifted, and we were kind of like avoiding naming or addressing what the deeper longing was. And obviously, as children, you have no idea that this is going on. There's no language around it. There's no education around it, but it's all happening in the unconscious spaces. And so for me, like maybe to clarify something that you were sharing, Ian, is that it's not a sexual space, but it is an erotic space. And what that means is we're opening up to the full spectrum of feelings and sensations that arise, learning how to recognize them, to interpret those signals, and how to respond to them in intelligent ways that actually nourish and nurture relationships, like I was saying before, rather than fracture or fragment them. And that is only possible if there's a degree of honest self-disclosure and a willingness to pursue those impulses, because this is part of the force of Eros. Eros is responsible for all forms of attraction, creative inspiration, pleasure. All of these things are connected to the force of Eros. And to untether that from sexual implications is really important, that there's actually space for arousal without sexual contact or pursuit. What is arousal? Arousal is a surge of life force that contains some quality of attraction or pleasure or an enlivening effect. It's a really positive thing. Just to experience arousal is a really positive force. And then we get to choose what to do with that. And if we never actually surface those things, then they stay in the shadow and they start taking on shadow expressions of manipulation or coercion or hiding or lying, all the things that actually start to destroy a relationship, because suppressing the movement towards connection does not suppress the desire for it. And so it will find other ways to go about it, and it's layered in shame and guilt and fear, and it turns into this whole beast that sometimes takes decades, sometimes generations to start unwinding. And so it's like peeling away all of those layers to acknowledge what is actually present and to be honest with it, so that each person is empowered to name and to pursue their own genuine desires, while also equipping everybody to have the skill and the capacity to assert their own boundaries so that healthy relationship can be maintained. So all these pieces tie in together. And again, I think Eros is at the core of all of it. Everybody longs for intimacy. It's not a desire, it's a human need. If a child isn't given physical affection when it's born, it will die. This is a primal need in humans, and it's just been fragmented and fractured in men's relationship to other men. And I think that's a big part of the repair.
Deus, I love feeling your passion as you speak about this.
Thank you.
Get in there with it.
Yeah.
And it shows in the work that you do because it's integrated through. And I want to speak in particular to, in this retreat, yes, welcoming in sensuality and Eros to a space, an all men's space, is edgy. And you were speaking to your responsibility to transfer the skill set And what you both did in this retreat was give us a protocol. Here's how to get in touch with what I want. Here's how to express what I want with someone else in this container. Here's how to get consent, to offer a no, to receive a no, and how to navigate the Eros and the erotic impulses when they do arise. So it wasn't just, okay, guys, like eroticism is great, let's all open that up. It was, here's a step-by-step way that we can do this where everybody's on board and everybody understands what's happening, and we're all empowered to navigate the dynamics in a good way. And that for me is like the incredible thing about this retreat. That's why I'm lit up and coming here wanting to share back about it.
Thank you for that.
Okay, so, two men who are holding space together have to navigate who's in control, what's happening, how to compromise with each other. And so as someone who facilitates, I got the pleasure of getting to sit in the space and witness you two navigate how to deal with the time. Oh, we don't have enough time for this, so what gets cut? How to support each other to both shine your light in a beautiful way, and to do that within the overarching container of the retreat, in service to the experience of the men. So what I want to ask both of you, so masterfully done, good job, I love it. What I want to ask you two is, what's your favorite part about facilitating with each other?
Thanks for that, Matt. Yeah, I can say that a number of men over the last, we've done 4 level 1s in person and then this recent level 2. And that's something we've heard a few times from men who are actually like, wow, seeing you both facilitate is actually something. And for me, though, what that speaks to is how rare it is to see 2 men in solidarity actually in service, right? And not in this subtle competition and kind of, who's in charge or power over. And so that's more something that I take that, I don't take that lightly, like that we're able to model something actually that feels significant and rare amongst men in this culture. And I can just give a nod, though, that I saw things like this at Tamera, the community in Portugal, where the men that were holding, oftentimes with spaces like Forum, which is a sort of transformational group process, as well as the Global Love School, I saw this a few times over, that how the men were with each other and how they were in service to something. And so I just feel like that really imprinted something on me. Right, of like, oh, this is possible. Actually, this is possible. Like that, the frequency of that suddenly was activated in me. So at least that's what I'm bringing in terms of Deus and I's collaboration. I think it also speaks to, we have been friends for I think a decade at least, or just over a decade, and so we've had a lot of time in just friendship and just and not like we hung around each other a lot. I mean, he lives in a different city. I've lived in a few other cities. So it's not like it was necessarily time in person. But I think overall there's a sense of like, I trust his instincts, right? That we have a certain coherence amongst each other, that if he feels strongly about something, like I would trust, okay, yeah, you've got it, right? Or if, I brought something and I'm like, ooh, I feel really, really clear about something. And I sense that he also just trusts my instincts because we're both tracking the same thing. We often say it's like, I don't know, riding the dragon, right? Of this emergent creature that we're co-stewarding together, not at the center of, but that we're, again, like navigating a ship through. And so, yeah, there's something around the joy of that to come to a place with another man in particular where, we can really lean on each other's medicine and what we each bring, and also like find a real interlocking coherence that seems really to increase the capacity of either of us, what we could do alone. And that, again, as like a phenomenon that I've now become more aware of, is actually pretty incredible. And I would say, in some sense, I'm curious to hear Deus' take on this too, that our capacity to work together in that way allows more life in, right? In that sense, the vessel that we're able to co-create together allows more life in, which is what increases the capacity and the possibility of real magic.
Yeah, there's a lot I could say about this, and I share with Ian often how much I admire him and really appreciate the unique skill set that he brings and his perspectives. And when we're facilitating together, kind of tying this into something that I was sharing before of not pushing a personal agenda, is that we're tracking similar things, but we might have different perspectives or approaches with the mutual recognition that both of our perspectives are valuable. And that opens up the opportunity for collaboration. Rather than pushing a personal agenda, we're bouncing our perspectives back and forth to find the middle path, or when it's appropriate for me to, let Ian take the reins on something, or he passes something over to me, and we're debriefing every day to, check in. And again, there's a long history of this. Like, Ian and I have been in counsel with each other many times. Like, I'll go to Ian if I am going through something challenging, and vice versa, and we'll offer perspectives or space holding. Like, I'm aware of Ian's shadow. I'm aware of Ian's shortcomings and his patterns, and vice versa. But there's no judgment there. There's actually a sense of camaraderie and affection and mutual support that I think translates into the work that we do as we're facilitating. But it's also our responsibility to hold each other accountable. So we're an ongoing resource for each other, not just in the containers that we're facilitating, but in our day-to-day lives. And I think that forms a really strong relationship and creative possibilities when we're collaborating. And it's also really helpful to have complementary skill sets, because I resonate a lot with the work that Ian is putting out, but it's not necessarily the territory that I'm well versed in, but I'm well versed in a lot of complementary territory that weaves in seamlessly with his skill set. And so just on a practical level, it works really well for creating a very multifaceted and rich experience for people.
Yeah, and it shows. And the complementary nature of what you bring, I like that term, welcomes more life in. It broadens and deepens the experience in the retreat. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
Can I ask you a question, Matt? Totally. I don't know how much time we have, but I am curious how it was for you. I know you were naming this at a few different points of coming into the container as a facilitator and kind of like tracking the way that we're facilitating, and what that shift was for you from kind of like a observational place into actually like dropping in and going into your own experience. And what was it that actually allowed you to do that, if that did happen?
Oh yeah, totally. That's a great question. I mean, when we arrived on the first day and we were standing outside in a circle and calling in the directions, I could feel the coherence in the field of the space that you two were creating. And there was like a nervous system like, great. I can relax into this space. I know how to hold myself in a space when I don't feel that level of coherence. Like, I can take care of myself. But like immediately, just what you two welcomed in, I was like, oh, I don't have to do that. Thank God. Okay, great. But then just to out myself, there's always that voice in here that's like, oh, this is how they're doing that. And oh, they're making that decision there. Like the tracking thing. And it's like, man, I want to turn that off, because I can choose to be in that critical, judgmental, note-taking mode, and it's fun for me. But I can also choose to just deepen into my experience and really receive what you're actually inviting as a participant, which is what I want. That's my intention. But the coherence that you two brought to the field allowed me to not have to hold myself in the container that I didn't feel fully bought into. So I think that's the answer to your question.
Thank you.
So as we're starting to get to the close of this conversation, I want to just look forward a little bit and into the possibilities, because I'm coming out of this retreat with inspiration on a number of levels. For me personally, as a facilitator, and now I'm writing books about men's work, one of the desires I have is for a peer space, a peer network of people who are facilitating on the topic of masculinity. And in going to this retreat, there's nuggets of gold for me to show up and be a participant. But then there's also, like, in the network and this conversation and what's happening between the three of us in the aftermath, there's also a lot of gold here, because now you have a better sense of who I am. I have a better sense of who you are. I can send, future participants your way to your offerings. And so my desire, my inspiration is to pull together people who are doing facilitation around the topic of masculinity so that we can be in this supportive role of learning from each other, of growing with each other and helping support each other. And that by collaborating, it supports this larger mission of shifting the culture of masculinity. And that's like the big goal for me. And so a conversation like this helps me to get connected to what's possible when we choose not to just be in competition with each other, but choose to support and uplift each other in service to the bigger picture. Yeah.
Beautiful. And how would you like to invite men into this space as well? And again, like you even said too, it's not just men in particular, but any of folks who are working on masculinity to align it to more of a healthy paradigm. But is there a way that they can connect, or I could put some stuff in the show notes?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right now, this is in the early phases of me shopping around this idea. And so the best way at this moment is, if somebody's interested, to just reach out to me and I can give you my contact information. Anybody of any gender or orientation who is focusing on facilitating or leading on the topic of masculinity and wants to be in a peer network would be welcome to reach out and join the conversation. So I have a little write-up, and I'm just gathering together people who feel aligned with the value of this type of network or connection right now. And then we'll see where it goes. We'll see where that takes us.
Thank you. And maybe one button I'll put on this is that it's really important to have a variety of people with a variety of perspectives to come together in council, because everybody will have a different perspective or approach. And if we can shift our relationship away from something that's competitive into something that's collaborative, it actually illuminates the possibilities in a way that supports all of us. And so your unique perspective is important, and you don't need to shift your orientation or perspective to another. It's actually really important to carry your own and to offer it to a space that's able to receive it, so that we can all learn and grow and broaden our understanding and application of all of these things. So it's not about becoming a melting pot. It's more about making space for all the multifaceted voices so that we can learn and grow together. And I really honor and celebrate you for initiating that and carrying this vision.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's call it there. This conversation winding to a close. Thank you both for facilitating each other and all of us in this dive at this particular moment. And I look forward to future conversations as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for hosting me.
Mm-hmm.